Everyone assumes they know the answer. The old were abandoned, left behind when the group moved camp, given a final meal, and then gently, or not so gently, left alone with the cold and the dark. It is the story the word prehistoric tends to generate in people who have never examined the actual evidence. A brutal, efficient arithmetic in which anyone who could no longer hunt, no longer gather, no longer carry their own weight, was simply subtracted from the equation. The Stone Age, by this account, had no room for passengers. It is a satisfying theory. It has the bleak, efficient ring of a world that operated on pure survival logic without sentiment. It is also, in most of what matters, wrong. Not wrong because the Stone Age was a paradise. Not wrong because early humans were free of cruelty, but wrong in the specific claim that old and disabled people were routinely eliminated, left to die, considered useless burdens by the people around them. The archaeological record tells a different story, and the evidence is not ambiguous. It is, in fact, far more unsettling in its implications than the original assumption. Here is the first piece of evidence. It came out of a hillside in the Republic of Georgia, from a place called Dmanisi, where excavations that began in the 1980s eventually produced something researchers were not prepared for. 5 skulls of early Homo, dated to roughly 1.8 million years ago. Among them, designated by researchers as skull D3444, is a jaw. Both it and the corresponding skull are immediately strange. The tooth sockets are not empty the way a skeleton's usually are, with the root canals open and sharp-edged. These are smooth, rounded, healed over with bone that had grown back in, filling the spaces where teeth used to be. Every single molar gone. The entire chewing surface of the jaw resorbed and sealed. That process takes time. Years, not weeks. The individual had lost all their teeth and the bone had grown back in, and the individual had kept living. In a landscape where food required chewing, raw meat, gristle, roots, whatever was available that day, this person could not have fed themselves. The Smithsonian Institution's Human Origins program, which has studied the Dmanisi fossils in detail, states the conclusion plainly. The group must have taken care of this individual. Someone was processing food for them. Someone was feeding them soft tissue, marrow, brain, things that could be managed without molars, for the years it took for that bone to resorb and fill in the way the fossil shows it did, 1.8 million years ago. That is the date on the first clear evidence of what researchers call paleoanthropological altruism, the group choosing to sustain someone who could not sustain themselves. It predates the oldest known intentional burial by more than 1 million years. This is not a minor footnote. This is the oldest story we have. The standard account of prehistoric life, the brutal arithmetic of survival, makes a logical error so deep that it is rarely named. It assumes that caring for the old and sick was a cost, and that prehistoric humans calculated it as such. But the evidence from site after site, across species, and across hundreds of thousands of years, points to a different reality. Caring for the dependent was not the exception. It was the pattern. And the pattern, once you see it, raises a different question entirely. Not why they kept the old alive, but what the old were actually for. Stay with that question, because the answer will rewrite how you think about human intelligence itself. The jaw from Dmanisi was the earliest, but it was not the last. Far north of Georgia, roughly 60,000 years later in geological terms, in the mountains of what is now Iraqi Kurdistan, a Neanderthal group was using a cave as a recurring shelter. Shanidar Cave, excavated from the early 1950s onward by the American archaeologist Ralph Selecki and his team from Columbia University, eventually produced the remains of 10 Neanderthal individuals. The most studied of them, known to researchers as Shanidar 1, called Nandi by the excavation team, was between 30 and 45 years old at death, which for a Neanderthal placed him in the category researchers would recognize as elderly. His skeleton is a record of accumulated damage. He had suffered a severe blow to the left side of his face at some point, leaving a crushing fracture around his left eye socket that would have left him partially or fully blind on that side. His right arm had been broken repeatedly and at some point lost, likely amputated above the elbow. His right leg showed fractures. His collarbone showed signs of infection. Researchers who have studied the skeleton, including the paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkaus, who published a foundational analysis of the Shanidar remains, have concluded that he was deaf. One-eyed, one-armed, lame, deaf. He lived for years with all of it. The healing in the bones, the healed fractures, the long-term evidence of chronic conditions survived over time can only be explained by one thing. Others around him were compensating for what he could not do. Someone hunted for him. Someone passed food to him in a form he could eat. Someone stayed close enough to help him navigate a landscape he could barely hear and half see. He did not survive alone. He was not abandoned. He was, by any honest reading of the evidence, kept alive by people who chose to keep him alive at a cost in time and resources that the brutal arithmetic of the standard account says they could not have afforded. If you are still here, tracking this through the bones and the decades of excavation, you already sense what is coming, because the question that resolves all of this is not whether early humans cared for their elderly. That is now answered. The question is why it made sense to do so in a world where nothing that did not contribute to immediate survival should have lasted. Subscribe now. If this is the kind of question that grabs you and will not let go. Everything on this channel exists for exactly this: the parts of human prehistory that upend the story you were given. And what comes next is the reason the old were not just kept alive. They were the most important people in the group. In 2004, anthropologists Rachel Kaspari of the University of Michigan and Sang-Hee Lee of the University of California at Riverside published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that analyzed 768 hominid fossils from successive periods: Australopithecines, early and middle Pleistocene Homo, Neanderthals, and early modern humans of the Upper Paleolithic. They were measuring a simple ratio: older adults to younger adults in the death distributions of each period. The question they were asking was when, across human evolution, did people start living long enough in significant numbers to matter demographically? What they found was a pattern with one rupture in it. There was a gradual, modest increase in longevity across the earlier periods. And then, in the early Upper Paleolithic, roughly 30,000 years ago, the ratio of older to younger adults in the samples did not increase modestly. It increased by a factor of roughly 5 compared to Neanderthal samples. In a single period, the number of people surviving to what Kaspari and Lee defined as old, double the age of reproductive maturation, quintupled. 5 times as many old people in one geological moment. Kaspari's own interpretation of what this means is striking. She has spoken publicly about the coincidence of timing. The Upper Paleolithic is exactly when the archaeological record fills with what researchers used to call the creative explosion, not the first appearance of symbolic behavior, but the sudden density and persistence of it. Cave paintings, sophisticated tools, long-distance exchange of materials and objects, the complex cultural life that suddenly leaves a thick, continuous trace in the record. Earlier cultures, she notes, seem to appear and disappear, small pockets of innovation that did not last. The Upper Paleolithic marks the point at which culture became cumulative, self-sustaining, building on itself generation after generation, and the timing matches the arrival in real numbers of grandparents. The old did not survive the Stone Age despite being useless. They survived because they were anything but. They were, in the most literal and concrete sense, the repository of everything the group needed to know. Consider what knowledge means in a world without writing. Every technique for making a tool, every medicinal plant, every pattern of animal migration, every precedent for how the group had resolved a conflict or survived a bad winter 20 years ago, all of it lived inside human memory. And the longer a person had lived, the more of it they carried. A woman of 50 who had seen 3 droughts and knew which tubers held water when the rivers dried. A man of 40 who remembered where his grandfather had found flint of a particular quality and could still walk there. An elder who had been through the last epidemic of whatever sickness was circulating and knew who had recovered and what they had done. Polly Wiesner, the anthropologist at the University of Utah, who spent 4 decades studying the Juhwansi of southern Africa's Kalahari Desert, published a study in 2014 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examining what actually happened around campfires in hunter-gatherer societies. She found that daytime conversation in these communities was dominated by economics, food, resources, logistics. Night conversations around the fire were something else entirely. They were stories. Stories about people in distant groups, about how conflicts had been resolved, about what had happened before anyone present had been born. And those stories, Visner noted, almost always came from the old. The firelit night, in other words, was where the elderly earned their keep. They were the living archive. They were the continuity between one generation's hard-won knowledge and the next. Without them, every cohort started from scratch, or close to it. With them, knowledge compounded. The catastrophic lessons of the past survived long enough to be useful in the future. This is what Kasperi's demographic data implies, at the deepest level. The creative explosion of the Upper Paleolithic, the moment when human culture became something that could outlast any single life, coincided with the moment when enough old people were surviving long enough to pass it on. Culture and longevity co-evolved. One could not sustain itself without the other. And now, come back to the jaw from Dmanisi, the smooth, rounded bone where the molars had been. 1.8 million years ago, someone in a group of early Homo made a choice, or lived by an instinct so deep it predated anything we would call a decision, to feed an individual who could not feed themselves. They probably did not know why. They would not have articulated it in terms of knowledge preservation or cultural transmission. They did it because that individual was one of them, and leaving them to die was not something they did. But the consequences of that act, and all the acts like it across the immense span of human prehistory, were not small. Every elder who was fed rather than abandoned carried inside them something that the group needed. Every winter survived, every drought, every predator avoided. Some fraction of that knowledge lived longer because the person who held it was allowed to live longer. The jaw that healed over at Dmanisi was not just an act of early compassion. It was, in a very real sense, the beginning of what we now call civilization. The choice to value someone for what they knew rather than what they could still do. The assumption that the Stone Age had no room for passengers is the assumption of a world that ran on pure muscle and pure immediacy, where the only thing that mattered was what you could do today. That world never existed. The world that did exist was messier, slower, more fragile, and more recognizably human. The old person by the fire, unable to hunt or gather or walk long distances, was not a problem the group was solving. They were the reason the group could survive at all. What does it tell you about us that the first evidence of compassion in the human fossil record is a jaw with no teeth? Kept alive in a world that had every reason to look away? Leave that thought in the comments, because the people who sit with a question like that are exactly who this channel was made for.